What's up? Before I was a scholar, before I learned to read, before I started working on this PhD, I was listening to music closely, listening to the radio closely, especially because I was born in the 1970s in Los Angeles, California. There was a radio station called KDAY, which was on AM, 1580 AM, right? And it was Los Angeles, California's first quote-unquote hip-hop/rap radio station. So I begged my grandmother for a boombox. And one of the things that made sense to me from watching the B-boys and the B-girls in my neighborhood in Los Angeles, California, was having that boombox on your shoulder with your ear to the speaker. That is the image that describes what I call DJ scholarship. It is a speaker box to the ear and a close listening. And it starts in the 1980s. So my name is DJ Lynnée Denise. I'm a Capricorn. If that, oh. Hey. I'm a Taurus. Okay, wait a minute. Hold on. Okay, so Earth. I get it though, Earth, color, material, groundedness, okay, but Capricorn, as I said, born in 1975. And I consider myself to be a survivor of the 80s because Ronald Reagan was president where I lived, and because AIDS was introduced during that time, and because crack cocaine became a massive public health issue around addiction, and that addiction in the 1980s was then criminalized, which opened up a huge kind of like shark-like mouth of what you call the prison industrial complex, right? So here I am in 2023, a 48-year-old woman, thinking about the ghost who died from AIDS, thinking about the ghost who were still sitting in prisons, thinking about the ghosts who were snatched from our communities. And because I am a DJ, I am thinking about the ghosts who were disappeared from the dance floor. Y'all with me? So I want to bring Sylvester into the room and ask his permission to speak on behalf of and to receive the information from the ghost from dance floors in the 1980s. The DJs, the dancers who were disappeared. So my work comes with ghost. I come with ghost. My work comes with ghost. The dance floor comes with ghost. I want to think about refuge, juicy refuge. I want to think about displaced spaces called ballrooms. I want to think about a dancing body responding to the DJ through voguing and whacking and breakdancing. I want to think about the slippery slope in the context of sex and how it became a question of fatal pleasure. And that is my entry point into the turntables. That's what happens. These are the questions that surface when I put earphones over my ears. I begin to hear questions. And I think about the needle as a line of questions. So I might drop the needle on a Black queer enclave in Detroit, right? And when I drop that needle on the city of Detroit in a Black queer space, what I might hear is the sound of techno. I might hear Aretha Franklin. I might hear Alice Coltrane. I might hear the 1967 riots that took place in Detroit. I might hear the 1971 movement from Motown in Detroit to Motown moving to Los Angeles. I might hear Michael Jackson as a child if I dropped the needle on the city of Detroit. You get what I'm saying? You see what happens when you listen to a city? That stories might be told and not just about music. Because I also might drop the needle on Detroit and learn about a character called Malcolm X, who spent his life, right, in that city at one point as a hustler, referred to as Detroit Red. I might drop that needle and hear Martin Luther King, who goes to Detroit and asks Aretha Franklin's father, C.L. Franklin, for money to support the civil rights movement. So what I'm saying is that DJ scholarship, first and foremost, is about understanding Black music beyond its entertainment value. What does it mean to think about Black people, period, beyond their purpose of entertaining you? What happens when you connect that entertainment to slavery? Right? So, and what happens when you connect slavery to the notion of a kind of secret joy and an escape from surveillance? And what happens when you think about these hostile Reagan policies against what they called a gay queer plague, also known as AIDS? What happens when you bring in the conversation of a mean-spirited government regime and the blood on its hands? But then I have to look at the church as well, if we're talking about the 80s, and if we're talking about ballroom culture, and if we're talking about voguing. So very few people are used to having conversations about AIDS, Reagan, voguing, disappearing dance floors, death, fatal pleasure, addiction, house music, techno, gospel music, blues, jazz, hip hop, and all of those things that are happening in the 80s. And not just happening, developing. So when we are talking about one of the most violent times against Black and brown, but queer folks in general, we're also talking about the emergence of one of the most sophisticated, techno-obsessed genres of music that comes out of a queer experience. All of that is happening at once. Juicy refuge, displacement, innovation out of hardship, secrecy, networks, kinships, gatherings, death, weekly parties, and weekly funerals. That is what is attached to house music and to techno music and to disco music. So every year when ADE happens here, the question becomes, are people listening beyond entertainment? Or are they listening to be entertained? Luckily, ADE folks reached out to me this year and said, would you be down to help us contextualize house music and techno music? And so those discussions are growing. And I'm glad to be part of a kind of Amsterdam network and a trusted voice in the conversation. But when I say trusted, I'm talking about by the ghost. I think that the ghosts trust me, right? Sometimes they're quite annoyed with me. Most times they trust me to speak about this thing called house music and techno music and disco music and music and visual culture in the 1980s Black queer diaspora in general, because yes, I am from the States. Yes, there is a global hyper focus on Black American culture globally, but I am also interested in conversations in the 1980s queer diaspora that was happening in Jamaica, in South Africa, in London, because there is a diasporic dialogue that was happening musically, that if it weren't for Jamaicans migrating to New York, I'm not sure we could claim that hip hop would exist. If the sound system didn't migrate from London, from Jamaica to London, I'm not sure we can claim grime, drum and bass, jungle as independent entities. But then you have to look at reasons why people are migrating. Why is it that we are having to migrate and leave these former British, I was gonna say Dutch, colonies, right, to find work, to find better working wages, right, to find better living, to find better living conditions? Why are we having to leave our islands and our homes to find better living conditions in these actual colonial empire states? That's one question. Another question is, what happens? How are we welcomed when we arrive? And then another question might be, and then where do we go and listen and then create music? Y'all with me? So quiet. Let me hear you say, ho! I'm not as intense as I sound. Do I sound intense? Oh, because y'all are looking at me like, woo. And I'm like, I must have come, I come with ghosts. I'm much more lighter than the ghosts who I walk with today. Sometimes they're much more playful. Today they're like, tell these folks about what the hell is going on. I'm like, okay. I just showed up. But when I think about music and visual culture in the 1980s and that Black queer diaspora, yeah, I am thinking about, you guys are in art school, I'm thinking of like art school in London, like St. Martin's, right? And then these massive Black queer film collectives that came out of those schools, right? And those artists who were learning how to be both activists and intellectuals, or as Gramsci would suggest, organic intellectuals, right? Creating this amazing anti-colonial work, anti-apartheid work, Reagan work, critique, social critique in the music, or Refuge in the dancing body, right? I'm thinking about all these different places that have been in conversation historically that we forget to kind of think about why they were in conversation, why we were speaking English, although we were from all these different places. How is it that we're all speaking English, right? So this is Grace Jones, who is from Jamaica and London, and is a massive Black queer music figure and androgynous. And really my introduction to the idea of someone who is gender nonconforming before that language began to circulate. Dark-skinned Black woman who was a force on the disco scene in New York, in these club queer spaces, at Studio 54, at Paradise Garage, which I'll share a little bit about later. And then you have films like The Color Purple, which is in the middle, which is a film that was adapted from a book written by Alice Walker. But it's significant to me because it came out, I believe, in 1983. I was 8 years old, and I saw these two people kissing like how my parents kiss, like with a romantic touch, like with a sensual, erotic connection at the age of 8. And I was like, I think I'm gay. I might be gay because this shit is sexy. Oh my God, I knew I had a crush on Madonna. But I also had a crush on Prince, and right? So I'm like, I'm gay. There's the answer. Like Madonna, Prince, Michael Jackson, gay, right? But to see these two women in The Color Purple, the characters are Suge and Celie, Suge Avery and Celie, kiss and fall in love and touch each other, but then learn that this was a part of literature created by a Black woman in the 80s, and then ask more questions like, well, what other books are available in the 80s? And then learning about this massive literary movement of Black women who were writing these amazing fiction stories, oftentimes playing with themes around the blues and playing with sort of black feminist thought and different kind of everyday forms of resistance against patriarchy, and then learning about people like Bell Hooks and Toni Morrison and Gail Jones and June Jordan and Toni Cade Bambara. These are names that you all should perhaps try to remember, at least one of them, go and look them up, because they have everything to do with the sound of the 1980s. If you think about black music beyond entertainment, if you think about it coming out of a community of artists and intellectuals who were contributing to each other's practices, which is what you all are doing here. Like just that energy of creating in community. And then there's Willie Ninja, who is credited with sort of introducing voguing, right? Long before Madonna. Long before Madonna. But to be fair to Madonna, she was in the New York black and brown queer gay scene. Not just dating Basquiat because she was, but she was also at these underground black queer spaces. So when songs like Holiday, you guys know that song? Not only are they produced by black folks, Nile Rodgers in particular, like it's real, especially hers, this interesting like Italian woman, this family out of Italy and Jersey, like going to these 1980s underground club scenes. Like Madonna is very much so part of the creation of black queer music, as is David Bowie, Boy George, George Michael. But what's interesting about them is that they were listening to black music closely. All of them, Boy George, David Bowie, Madonna. But I want to get into just like all of these queer ass images in the 80s. Look at Prince. What is he wearing? My mom didn't want me to see it. And I was like, I'm going to look closer. And when she left, because here's the interesting thing, she didn't want me to see especially Purple Rain, but she had all his other albums, and those liner notes, whew, sexual content. Amazing, sensual content, right? So I was looking closely at Prince, and I was like, okay, well, he has on high heels, you know, what I read as a kind of G-string, his body is showing, he's thin, right? He's not giving you like this hyper-masculine, muscle-bound dude. He's giving you high heels and a G-string. He's doing splits. But then he also has these two women on stage with him, who I learned later, have been together for 10 years. And they were some of his co-creators. Those women are Wendy and Lisa. Anyone familiar with Lisa and Wendy? Good. They co-wrote Purple Rain, so many things, but they were together for years. But of course, Prince was always playing with queerness in his lyrics. Am I black or white? Am I straight or gay? Controversy, right? But then David Bowie, who was openly bi, married to Iman up until the time he passed, also a Capricorn, that's neither here or there, but it's important because of what he created in the world. And like, no, I'm biased. But the point is that just an incredible force in black queer culture, David Bowie. And not just because he was married to a black woman, and not just because he was in the New York clubs as well, because he was, and not just because the same person who produced Holiday produced Fame and Let's Dance, and that person is Nile Rodgers, and Nile Rodgers was a bassist from a group called Chic, and Chic produced a very famous song called Good Times, which is one of the first disco songs that was sampled that then became part of a massive Sugar Hill Gang classic, right? Like, so these links, these musical cross-pollinations, this queer identity, these kin and queer-based networks are part of what's creating these sounds. So David Bowie, like Madonna, was also produced by a black disco musician. I'm saying disco, but he was a musician before the word disco existed, right? So, but Chic is a famous group who basically took disco to the next level with the song Good Times, right? It has become like a sort of global disco classic. You guys familiar with the song Good Times? Raise your hand if you're not. Raise them high. This is a place where if you don't know the music, you'll be rewarded. You won't be judged. Let me see, raise your hands high. Okay, there's enough for us to hear that because we can't just go around. Right? Right? So it gets sampled and becomes... Right? So... Were you familiar when you heard it? How many of you heard it and was like, oh, I do know the song? Precisely. So that's what I mean by the importance of it and even the use of it as a sample, one of rap music's first sample in 1979. I want to say that Nile Rodgers did sue for that sample, and that's also the beginning of the question of the sample as a form of intellectual property, right? Because he said he was in one of these clubs and he was like, uh-oh, Good Times is on. It wasn't Good Times, right? It was this new song that was, interestingly enough, moving forward in the charts, collecting money. Wait, that's my song. That's my baseline. Where's my money, right? So anyway, that's a side note. The question that DJ Scholarship, or the questions that DJ Scholarship ask, one, how does music address the absence and presence of Black queer diaspora in the 1980s, right? So we've answered that in thinking about the ways in which music provides a kind of map for us to land the needle, if you will, in a city and ask different kinds of questions, right? So we're no longer gonna watch polls and say, oh, New York is a great place to be in the 1980s and they were voguing. We're gonna ask questions like, oh, what impact did AIDS have on the ballroom community? And we're going to ask questions like, I wonder how many DJs are still living from that era? And what did they witness as folks who saw this disappearing dance floor? We might ask questions like, how were folks able to find the emotional capacity to attend those weekly funerals and those weekly parties, right? So we're going to start asking different questions. To get what I mean? Yeah? Yeah. Hello? Damn. Yeah, it's interactive because I don't want to just be eaten. You get what I mean? Okay, like, cause I don't want to just be consumed. I want y'all to give something back, especially as a DJ. That's what I'm saying. I'm not a scholar first, right? So if I'm like, you know what I'm saying? I need the room to be like, yup, hell yeah, girl, something like that. Thank you. No, thank you. That works. What was the role of the queer DJ in the 1980s? This is a massive question. It's one of my research questions, and I'm happy because I had a breakthrough this week in thinking about the role of the queer DJ, right? Because I really feel like sampling and remixing gets a lot of play, even by me. I've been thinking about the importance of sampling. I think it's one of the most important interventions in music, technology, and history, to grab a piece of pre-recorded music, repurpose it, right, in this other area, and use that repurposing and that sampling as a kind of repository in a now kind of archive-informed genre of music. And what I mean by that is sampling has allowed me to learn that a group like Pink Floyd exists, a dude named Bach exists, a woman named Bjork exists, because these hip-hop DJs were sampling these sounds. Do you get what I mean? Right? So then hip-hop becomes a repository for other genres of music. And it also reflects a deep listening practice that these producers were having. So there's a reason why there's a lot of hurrah around sampling. We get it. And we understand that these DJs got even more clever. Because by the way, most producers, especially coming out of the 90s, started off as DJs, which means they started off listening closely, right? So it's awesome that we continue to talk about the genius of the sample, how innovative it was. And it's awesome to think about the remix and how we're using it metaphorically. Oh, I'm gonna remix my paper. Oh, I'm gonna remix this film. Like that we're using remixing very lightly. But I wanna actually have us think about the history of repetition, of repurposing, of reviewing, of reflecting, of rewind, when you hear Jamaicans DJs say, and the remix, this notion of doing it again, is a significant part of Black culture and Black life. Doing it again, remixing it, revisiting it, reflecting on it, rewinding the music, starting it from the beginning, going back to see and fetch what's there, making it yours, creating a sonic signature so that your community can hear when it's you and not them who created it before you came along. Now there are multiple versions of this thing in the archive because of the remix, because of the sample. But where do queer folks fit in that? And I found an answer. This is huge. So thank you, Taurus, see? This is huge. The answer is in the queer editing. Because it was a massive musical sort of innovative approach to editing the sound of a song that was already thought of. And what I mean by editing is that there is an original song, right? And in this context, I'm thinking of the late 70s, early 80s. I'm thinking of a DJ in particular named Ron Hardy, who died of AIDS, who was from Chicago, who is known to be the person who kind of ushered in house music at his party called the Music Box. But what he used to do was sit for hours with his reel-to-reel, listen to that song. I am not lying when I say you cannot edit a song without, or you shouldn't edit a song without listening to it at least 100 times. At least 100. You're gonna edit someone else's work? I need you to know that work like the inside of your hand. I need you to know every scream, every beat, every stop, every silence, every chorus before you make the decision to change it and to create your own version. Because that is where the distinction, that is where the signature is. That is what separates your song from the one that was sampled, right? So that's really important. So the queer edit is extremely important because it was something that came out of New York, Detroit, and Chicago queer club cultures, right? Taking that reel-to-reel, listening to that song a million times, and then sitting with it, literally physically cutting the tape and rearranging maybe the break beat in the middle and putting it in the front and extending it and looping it and literally altering life. Like, so imagine that a lot of the folks who were attending these parties were also listening to those songs hundreds of times. So they know exactly where the editing is. They're like, oh, that's an extended drum. Oh, you took that drum and put that in the front. Oh, that drum is 30 minutes. Not 30, I'm being extreme. That drum is now 3 minutes instead of 30 seconds. But isn't that queerness? Isn't that what we're queering things? We're extending the life of things. We're expanding things from the margins, creating a new center. From the margins, creating a new place to center ourselves in. From the margins, right? So that we're not stuck on the margins, but that we are altering the margins, that we are erasing the borders of the margin, the borders between the margins and the center, just by editing the song, just because you listen deeply, just because you care enough about your dance floor, just because your dance floor listens to you. That's a queer edit in the family with remixing. What makes it significant is that the original sits at the center. Still, that's a remix too, with the edit too. You could hear the echoes of the original, and you can also hear the new voices around the song, right? Y'all with me? So that's one of the things that Black queer DJs offer, this notion of the edit, the extension, right? And how do DJs offer a sanctuary under social duress? I mean, I don't know, like the closest thing to it obviously is COVID, right? In 2020, when we were really like, damn, like people are dropping around, similar government reaction too. Hey, those of you who are dying, it is something connected to your morality. It's something connected to your morality. Perhaps you weren't washing your hands enough. Of course, there's truth to that, scientific evidence that says that we can stop the spread. I get that, and I actually still wear masks because I still know that there's a pandemic, and I still know that Black folks died the most, so it's political. I still have friends who are immunocompromised folks, so it's real. It's important to think about the fact that there was someone sitting here right now with COVID, so we're taking chances. We know that, right? We just try to not think about it, and I get it. Capitalism creates a situation where if we think about it, we might be discouraged from going to work and producing a meal. And look at, like, I get it. Like, we can't afford it. We can't afford to think about it. I get it. So a similar conversation was happening in the 80s, abstinence or not. Should we be in these bathhouses having unprotected sex? We know there's a virus, but our government says this is essentially reserved for us. Should we be having sex? Should we continue to have sex? This was a massive question when these songs were coming out. These house music songs were coming out. These are the questions. Should we be having sex? There was a whole ass tension around gay folks who, I'm thinking about the ACT UP movement. I'm thinking about folks like, Keith Haring, who was an amazing visual artist, I'm sure you all are aware of, who also died of AIDS in the 80s, who was also at these queer clubs, but who was also creating images that said silence equals death. Y'all with me? It's a well-documented history if you guys are students of Warhol and, right? Like, are you? Aware of them. Maybe you're not like students of like, the tomato can from the inside out. You might not know that, you know what I mean? But these this pop art business, right? Right? And how even that pop art stuff is in that movement of the 80s and pushing up against the mean-spirited policies of, I'm gonna throw Thatcher in there too. Let's do that. Thatcher and Reagan, right? Because they were homies. They were folks. So, I mean, I just want to say all of that to say, that, and I'm far beyond, I'm far beyond my time, I think. Okay, so let me just wrap up, because I've gone far beyond my time here. So what I will say is that I will think about, so I coined the phrase DJ scholarship in 2013 to be able to name what I hear and to reposition the DJ and to make sure the DJ was aligned with these kind of Black intellectual traditions, but also Black traditions of explanation that happen through music. What I'm saying is that DJs are thinkers, that we have an investigative practice. That investigative practice includes chasing samples, digging through the crates, studying album cover art, reading liner notes, and through that becoming visually literate of the sort of the visual history of Black music or the visual culture of Black music that is on display through those album covers, and or reading and thinking about music critically, because I grew up reading serious album reviews and music journalism, and so now I'm in this PhD program thinking about a kind of theoretical framework for this work and reading theory around ethnomusicology, musicology, Black queer studies, performance studies, migration studies, but I am prepared because of the liner notes that I read, because of the music journalism that I spent years reading in the 90s. Like that the things that I was doing naturally as a DJ helped me create a method that is transferable into this PhD program. So in 1981 is when the first time someone heard the expression house music being used in Chicago. And the person who says he heard it was Frankie Knuckles. And Frankie Knuckles is someone who is from New York, who moved to Chicago in the late 70s at the height of this kind of, you know, post-disco culture, like between 79 and 82. You know, he had his own party in Chicago called The Warehouse. He said he was driving around Chicago one day and saw a record store, and there was a sign that said, if you want to buy house music, buy it here. And he was like, oh, what? What's house music? And they were like, you know, music you play at the warehouse. He wasn't playing the house music that we think we know now. He was actually playing disco and funk and dance floor gospel, right? Soul music, right? Because there's a whole history of what precedes and defines house music. And that is soul music and funk music. I mean, I would even argue some like sort of dirty Lee Scratch Perry dub, if you want to get in there. I mean, if you really want to get in there, gospel to dub, right? And so that's 1981. The other thing about 1981 is that it's the first time that AIDS is discovered in 3 young men in Los Angeles, California. The same year that we hear the word AIDS, we hear the word house. So I'm asking you, and I'll leave you with a song, to consider the ghost, to respect the ghost by asking more from Black music, by asking more of Black folks in terms of how you receive entertainment from them, from us, from the ghost.